The trauma bay was slick with blood, the heart monitor screaming a continuous flatline pitch that usually meant the end. 6 heavily armed men, covered in mud and tactical gear, stood paralyzed, their imposing frames filling the sterile room. They were the world's most elite operators, yet they were entirely helpless as their brother bled out on the table. The civilian doctors had already stepped back, shaking their heads. But then, the quiet, unassuming night shift nurse stepped forward. She didn't ask for permission. She didn't flinch. What she did in the next 3 minutes would leave the entire SEAL team standing at strict attention, saluting a woman they had completely underestimated. The Centera Virginia Beach General Hospital emergency room on a Tuesday night in November was usually a predictable carousel of minor car accidents, kitchen burns, and the occasional bar fight. The graveyard shift was a domain of fluorescent lights, stale coffee, and quiet exhaustion. For Nurse Sarah Jenkins, it was exactly the kind of anonymity she craved. Sarah was 34, with dark hair perpetually tied into a tight, no-nonsense bun, and eyes that held the weary stillness of an old soul. To her colleagues, she was a reliable, albeit intensely private, co-worker. She never attended the post-shift breakfasts at the local diner. She didn't participate in the nurses' station gossip about doctors or difficult patients. When asked about her past, she would offer a polite, vague smile and mention she had moved from the Midwest for a change of scenery. "She's basically a robot," Nurse Brenda Cole whispered one night to a resident, leaning over the triage desk. Brenda was a 20-year veteran of the ER, a woman who thrived on drama and felt slighted by Sarah's impenetrable walls. "I've worked with her for 2 years, and I don't even know if she has a cat. She just comes in, does her job flawlessly, and vanishes." "Maybe she's just focused," the resident replied, watching Sarah meticulously restock the trauma carts in Bay 4. "Focused is one thing, disconnected is another," Brenda snorted. "You watch her during a code. It's like she's not even there. No panic, no adrenaline. It's unnatural." What Brenda called unnatural, Sarah called survival. The meticulous organization of bandages, the precise calibration of IV drips, the sterile, brightly lit confines of the civilian hospital. It was a controlled environment. It was safe. It was a world away from the dust, the noise, and the copper smell of blood baking on desert sand. On this particular night, a massive nor'easter was battering the Virginia coastline. Rain lashed against the reinforced glass of the ER doors, and the wind howled with a localized fury that made the heavy buildings shudder. The storm had knocked out power to several neighboring counties, filling the waiting room with a chaotic overflow of localized traumas. Dr. Thomas Aris, the attending trauma surgeon, was visibly stressed. A brilliant tactician of the human body, Dr. Aris was nevertheless a man who relied heavily on the predictability of modern medicine. He liked his charts complete, his imaging clear, and his environment controlled. The storm was stripping away those luxuries. "Jenkins," Dr. Aris barked, rubbing his temples as he looked at the overflowing tracking board. "I need you to double-check the backup generators. Facilities said we're running on secondary power, and if we get a major trauma, I need to know the CT scanner isn't going to die mid-spin." "Already checked, Doctor," Sarah replied, not looking up from the monitor she was calibrating. "Generators 2 and 3 are fully operational. We have a 72-hour fuel reserve. I also rerouted the redundant power supply to bays 1 through 4, just in case." Dr. Aris paused, blinking in surprise. "Right. Good. Thank you, Sarah." Before he could say anything else, the red emergency radio on the main desk crackled to life. It wasn't the standard dispatch channel used by local EMS. It was the encrypted emergency frequency, a direct line rarely used, tied directly to the military installations dotting the region, including the heavily fortified Naval Air Station Oceana and the secretive Dam Neck Annex, Centera Base. "This is Outlaw 14. Be advised, we are inbound. ETA, 4 minutes. I repeat, ETA, 4 minutes." The voice on the radio wasn't a paramedic. It was rough, strained, and drowned out by the deafening, rhythmic thwack, thwack, thwack of heavy helicopter rotors. Brenda rushed to the radio. Outlaw 1-4, this is Centaura ER. We have no inbound flights logged. The storm has grounded all medevac units. Who is this? We are not medevac, Centaura. We are military. We have an alpha priority trauma, massive hemorrhage, penetrating chest wound. Patient is circling the drain. Have your best surgical team at the helipad now. Outlaw out. The radio went dead. Dr. Aris stared at the radio, the color draining from his face. A military bird? In this weather? The wind shear out there is 50 knots. They're landing, Sarah said. Her voice had changed. The quiet, passive tone was gone, replaced by something sharp and authoritative. She was already moving, pulling 2 heavy trauma bags from the locked cabinet. Brenda, clear Bay 1. Move the laceration in bed 2 to the hallway. Dr. Aris, you need to gown up. Wait a minute, Jenkins. We don't even know what we're dealing with, Dr. Aris stammered, overwhelmed by the sudden shift in protocol. Military protocol dictates they go to Portsmouth Naval. If they are landing here instead of Portsmouth, it means he doesn't have the time to make it across the water, Sarah said, tossing a lead apron and sterile gown onto Dr. Aris's chest. Let's go. Now. The automatic doors to the ambulance bay blew open, letting in a howling gust of wind and rain that scattered loose paperwork across the nurse's station. The sound of the helicopter was deafening, vibrating the floorboards and rattling the glass cabinets. It wasn't the high-pitched whine of a civilian life flight. It was the heavy, thundering pulse of an MH-60M Black Hawk. Sarah, Dr. Aris, and 2 orderlies stood in the sheltered alcove of the emergency entrance, fighting against the prop wash and the stinging rain. Through the sheets of water, Sarah saw the massive black silhouette of the chopper touch down hard on the tarmac, bypassing the rooftop helipad entirely due to the severe weather. Before the wheels had even settled, the side door slid open. 4 men emerged into the storm. They were massive, terrifying figures, moving with a synchronized, predatory urgency. They wore unmarked, mud-caked tactical gear, heavy plate carriers, and helmets, equipped with panoramic night vision goggles, flipped up. There were no name tapes, no unit patches, just heavily armed phantoms operating in the dead of night. Between them, they carried a specialized combat litter. Move, move, move. The lead operator roared, his voice cutting through the storm and the rotor wash. He was a giant of a man, his face painted in camouflage and streaked with blood. Sarah grabbed the head of the litter alongside the lead operator, helping them guide the gurney through the sliding glass doors and into the harsh, blinding light of the hospital corridor. As they hit the fluorescent lights, the severity of the situation became horrifyingly clear. The man on the litter, a heavily muscled operator in his late 20s, was a ruined mess of torn Kevlar and shredded flesh. His tactical uniform was completely saturated with dark, arterial blood. His skin was the color of wet ash. Bay 1, straight ahead, Sarah ordered, sprinting alongside the gurney. What happened? Dr. Aris asked, struggling to keep pace, his eyes wide at the sight of the heavily armed men storming his civilian ER. Training op went kinetic. The lead operator barked. Explosive breech failure, followed by shrapnel and a long fall. He's got a massive arterial bleed in the right thigh, stabilized with a makeshift tourniquet, but it's slipping. He took a heavy piece of spalling straight through the right side of his chest. They burst into Bay 1. The operators didn't step back to let the medical staff work. They crowded the room, their anxiety and adrenaline turning them into hostile obstacles. All right, gentlemen, step back. Let us work. Doctor, Aris shouted, trying to assert authority. He reached for the injured man's chest rig. I need trauma shears. Cut this gear off him. One of the operators, a man with cold blue eyes and a blood-soaked beard, grabbed Dr. Aris's wrist with crushing force. You don't just cut this gear, Doc. There are live pyrotechnics and a secondary charge on this rig. You pull the wrong tab, you blow this whole room to hell. Dr. Aris froze, paralyzed by the physical threat and the realization that he was entirely out of his depth. The civilian medical team hesitated, exchanging terrified glances. "He's crashing," Brenda screamed from the monitor. "Heart rate is 160 and thready. Blood pressure is 60 over palp. He's losing his pressure." The injured man on the table let out a weak, agonizing gasp, his chest struggling to rise. Commander David Sterling, the lead operator, looked at the frozen doctor, his eyes blazing with desperate fury. "Do something. Fix him." Dr. Aris stuttered, looking at the complex, interlocking buckles of the tactical rig. I don't know how to take this off safely. We need a bomb squad. Get out of the way." A calm, commanding voice sliced through the chaos. Sarah stepped up to the table. She didn't look at Dr. Aris, and she didn't show an ounce of fear toward the towering SEALs. She pulled a specialized, curved hook blade from her own pocket, a tool not issued by Centera General. "Hold him down," Sarah ordered Sterling. Sterling blinked, caught off guard by the absolute authority in the small nurse's voice. "What?" "I said hold his shoulders down, Commander." "Now," Sarah snapped, using the military rank without thinking, reading his posture and bearing. She moved with blinding speed. She bypassed the quick-release tabs that a civilian would normally pull. Instead, she slipped her hook blade under the heavy shoulder straps, slicing precisely through the nylon webbing, avoiding the explosive breaching charges secured to the chest panel. In less than 5 seconds, she had stripped the heavy plate carrier away and tossed it to the floor. "Get that out of here," she ordered the operator, who had grabbed Dr. Aris. The SEALs stared at her, stunned by her surgical precision and knowledge of their specialized gear. With the chest exposed, the horrifying reality of the wound was visible. A jagged piece of metal had punctured the right upper quadrant of his chest. Blood was bubbling from the wound with every shallow, ragged breath. Sucking chest wound. "He's developing a tension pneumothorax," Sarah said, entirely unfazed. "Dr. Aris, I need a chest tube tray, 36 French, right now." Dr. Aris was still frozen. We need an X-ray first to confirm the placement." "We don't have time for a goddamn X-ray, Thomas," Sarah roared, dropping the quiet nurse facade entirely. "His trachea is deviating to the left. His jugular veins are distended, and he has absent breath sounds on the right side. He is suffocating on his own trapped air. Give me a 14-gauge needle." Brenda, trembling, handed Sarah the long decompression needle. "I'm putting it in the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line," Sarah announced, speaking more to the SEALs than the doctor, keeping them informed to keep them calm. She didn't hesitate. She found the anatomical landmark through the blood and muscle and drove the needle deep into the injured operator's chest. A sharp, violent hiss of escaping air filled the room. The monitor immediately began to reflect the relief of pressure. The injured man took a massive, shuddering gasp of air. "Airway secured," Sarah said, her voice dropping back to a cool, icy, professional tone. But the battle was only half over. "The leg!" Sterling shouted, pointing to the injured man's thigh. The makeshift tourniquet had completely failed. Bright red, oxygenated blood began to geyser from the massive laceration on his upper thigh, spraying across Sarah's scrubs. The femoral artery was severed. "Pressure is dropping again. 40 over palp," Brenda yelled, terror creeping into her voice. "We're losing him." "Dr. Aris, clamp that artery," Sarah ordered, applying direct, massive body weight onto the man's groin, her hands plunging directly into the gaping wound to find the severed vessel. Dr. Aris stepped forward, his hands shaking violently as he held a pair of hemostats. He looked into the pooling well of blood in the man's leg. I can't see it. There's too much blood. We need him in the OR. I can't do this blindly. He will bleed to death before the elevator doors open," Sarah growled. Her hands were submerged in blood, her fingers desperately searching for the slick, pulsing rubbery tube of the femoral artery. "Let me switch out," Sterling demanded, moving to take Sarah's place. "I have more body weight." "Back off," Sarah barked, shooting the SEAL commander a glare so ferocious, it stopped him in his tracks. "Your hands are too big, you'll tear the surrounding tissue. Give me combat gauze. Quick clot, now." "We don't carry quick clot in the civilian ER," Brenda cried out. Sarah cursed under her breath. "Commander, your IFAC. Left hip pouch, open it." Sterling didn't question her. He ripped open his individual first aid kit, pulling out a vacuum-sealed package of hemostatic combat gauze. Sarah snatched it from him, tearing it open with her teeth. "I'm going to pack the wound," Sarah said, looking directly into the injured man's eyes. His name, according to the bloody tape on his helmet, was Mitchell. "Mitchell, Ryan. Stay with me, buddy. This is going to hurt like hell." With brutal, necessary force, Sarah began packing the chemically treated gauze directly into the wound cavity, pressing it down against the severed artery. The hemostatic agents in the gauze reacted instantly with the blood, creating a massive exothermic reaction. Heat radiated from the wound. Mitchell, who had been barely conscious, arched his back off the table and screamed a raw, guttural sound of pure agony. "Hold him," Sarah commanded. Sterling and the other 3 operators threw their massive weight over their teammate, pinning his shoulders and uninjured leg to the table. "Keep the pressure on," Sarah told Dr. Eris. Both hands pushed down on the packing. "Do not let up for exactly 3 minutes." Dr. Eris, sweating profusely, obeyed, pressing down with all his might. Sarah stepped back, her hands dripping with blood, her chest heaving. She quickly turned to the monitors, rapidly inputting commands to the IV pumps. "Brenda, hang 2 units of O- on the rapid infuser. I want a gram of TXA pushed immediately, followed by a calcium chloride chaser. If we pump him full of cold blood without calcium, he'll go into cardiac arrest." Dr. Eris stared at her, his hands locked onto the wounded man's leg. Where did you learn that protocol? That's not standard civilian trauma care." Sarah ignored the question. She moved to the head of the bed, shining a penlight into Mitchell's eyes. "Pupils are sluggish, but reactive. His color is coming back." The chaotic noise of the ER seemed to fade away, leaving only the steady, rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor. The pressure was holding. The chest was decompressed. The bleeding had stopped. Commander Sterling slowly stood up from where he had been pinning his teammate down. He looked at the wreckage of the room, the bloody gear, the wrappers, the sheer volume of blood on the floor. Then he looked at the petite, dark-haired nurse who had just commanded his men, bypassed a live explosive, performed a textbook needle decompression, and managed a massive arterial hemorrhage using field-expedient combat tactics. "You didn't just guess which tab to pull on that plate carrier," Sterling said, his voice a low, heavy rumble. The aggressive panic from moments ago had vanished, replaced by a sharp, calculating scrutiny. "I made an educated guess, Commander," Sarah replied flatly, refusing to meet his eye as she charted the medications on the computer. "Bullshit," one of the other operators, a sniper with a thick southern drawl, muttered. "You knew exactly where the secondary charge was laced. You cut the webbing at the exact angle to bypass the trigger wire. And you asked for TXA and a calcium chaser," Sterling continued, taking a slow step toward her. "That is standard issue, TCCC, Tactical Combat Casualty Care. Civilian hospitals rely on massive transfusion protocols. They don't push TXA from the hip." "I read a lot of medical journals," Sarah said coldly. "Dr. Eris, the bleeding is controlled. We can transport him to OR3 now. You have a window." Dr. Eris nodded numbly. "Right. Yes. Orderlies, let's move him." As the gurney was wheeled out of the bay, the operators fell in line behind it, a protective wall of muscle and armor. But Commander Sterling lingered in Bay 1. He watched Sarah as she stood by the sink, rigorously scrubbing the blood from her arms with a harsh chemical sponge. "A civilian nurse doesn't step into a trauma with 4 panicked operators and take command," Sterling said quietly, over the sound of running water. "A civilian nurse doesn't look at a severed femoral artery and stay ice cold." Sarah turned off the water. She grabbed a paper towel, drying her hands meticulously. "Have a safe night, Commander." I hope your man recovers." She walked past him, her face an unreadable mask. But as she brushed past his shoulder, Sterling's eyes dropped to her right forearm. The scrubbing had rolled her scrub sleeve up. There, burned into the flesh just below her elbow, was a faded, jagged scar. It wasn't a surgical scar. It was the distinct, unmistakable starburst pattern of a high-velocity gunshot wound. Sterling stood alone in the bloody trauma bay, the pieces clicking together in his mind. Nurse Sarah Jenkins wasn't just a civilian who read medical journals. She was a ghost. The surgical waiting room on the second floor of Centaura General was a stark contrast to the blood-soaked chaos of the emergency bay. It was dead quiet, save for the relentless drumming of rain against the reinforced safety glass. Commander David Sterling stood by the window, staring out into the blackness of the Virginia storm, a lukewarm cup of vending machine coffee clutched in his large, scarred hands. His men, Petty Officer First Class Miller and Chief Petty Officer Jax Jackson, were slumped in the plastic chairs behind him. They had stripped off their ruined plate carriers, revealing sweat-soaked olive-drab t-shirts. The adrenaline crash had hit them hard, leaving a heavy, suffocating silence in its wake. Mitchell was still in OR3. Sterling pulled a secure, encrypted satellite phone from his cargo pocket. The storm was playing hell with the signal, but he managed to connect to the Joint Operations Center, JOC, at the Dam Neck Annex. "JOC, this is Outlaw 1-4, Sterling said quietly, turning away from his men. "Go ahead, 1-4. Status on Mitchell?" The voice on the other end belonged to Lieutenant Commander Reynolds, the Night Watch intelligence officer for their squadron, still in the meat grinder. "The civilian docs are trying to save the leg," Sterling replied. He paused, his eyes narrowing as he replayed the events of Bay 1 in his mind. "I need you to run a background check for me, Reynolds. Priority. On a civilian? During a localized state of emergency? What's the angle, Dave?" "She's the ER nurse who stabilized Mitchell," Sterling said, his voice dropping to a low murmur. "Dark hair, mid-30s. Name tag said Sarah Jenkins. She bypassed a live breaching charge on Mitchell's rig, performed a textbook needle decompression, and managed a severed femoral artery using combat packing techniques and TXA protocols. And she's carrying a 5-point starburst exit wound scar on her right forearm." There was a long silence on the encrypted line. "A starburst scar? That's a high-velocity 7.62 round fired from a severe distance. Sniper fire." "Exactly," Sterling said. "Run the name." Sterling listened to the faint, rapid clacking of a keyboard bleeding through the secure connection. A minute passed, then 2. "Commander," Reynolds said. His tone entirely changed. The casual camaraderie was gone, replaced by strict, rigid professionalism. "I just ran Sarah Jenkins through the National Crime Information Center and standard DoD databases. Nothing anomalous. She looks like a civilian from Ohio. But my system just flagged my terminal for attempting to cross-reference her biometrics with JSOC's secure archives," Reynolds explained, a hint of disbelief in his voice. "I had to use my level 5 clearance just to bypass the firewall. Her file is deeply redacted. The civilian nurse profile is a heavily manufactured ghost skin." Sterling felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. "Give me what you have." "Her real name is Jenkins, but she wasn't a civilian. She was Captain Sarah Jenkins, United States Army, Medical Service Corps. But she wasn't regular Army, Dave. She was attached to the Cultural Support Team, CST, and then pulled into a classified Joint Special Operations Command medical element." Reynolds paused, taking a breath. "Dave. She was the lead trauma surgeon attached to Task Force Black during Operation Viper's Nest in the Arghandab River Valley 5 years ago. The SIGA at Firebase Lima." Sterling's grip tightened on the phone until the plastic groaned. Every operator in naval special warfare knew the rumors of Firebase Lima. It was a black operation that went catastrophically wrong. A small coalition team had been pinned down by 300 Taliban fighters for 4 days. "The file says their primary surgical tent took a direct mortar hit on day 1, Reynolds continued quietly. Jenkins was the only surviving medical officer. She took a sniper round to the arm on day 2 while dragging a wounded ranger out of the kill zone. Despite a shattered forearm, she set up a triage center in a collapsed bunker and kept 14 critically wounded operators alive for 48 hours with zero resupply. She amputated limbs with a multi-tool and sterilized water. She was awarded the Silver Star, classified. And then she completely disappeared from the grid, medically retired, deep cover. Understood, Sterling whispered. Wipe the search, Reynolds. Erase the log. Already done. Outlaw out. Sterling lowered the phone. He turned and looked down the hallway. At the far end, near the elevator banks, Sarah Jenkins was leaning against the wall. She had changed into a fresh set of scrubs, but the exhaustion was etched deeply into the lines around her eyes. She was staring at her hands, rubbing the spot on her forearm where her sleeve covered the scar. Sterling walked down the sterile corridor, his heavy boots making no sound. He stopped a few feet from her. Sarah didn't look up immediately, but her posture shifted, her shoulders squaring ever so slightly. The waiting room is down the hall, Commander, she said, her voice neutral. Firebase Lima, Sterling said. The words were a quiet thunderclap. Sarah froze. For a fraction of a second, the civilian mask slipped. Her breath hitched, and her eyes darted to his, flashing with a sudden, cornered intensity. Then, just as quickly, the steel walls slammed back down. I don't know what you're talking about, she said coldly. 14 men came home because of you, Sterling continued, ignoring her denial. He didn't step closer. He kept his distance out of deep respect. Task Force Black. My former platoon chief was one of the rangers in that bunker. He told me the story of the ghost doctor who kept him breathing with one arm strapped to her chest. You are violating federal privacy laws and DoD operational security, Sarah warned, her voice dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper. I am a registered nurse at Centera General. That is all. Captain, Sterling said softly, you saved my man's life tonight because you didn't hesitate. You didn't panic when the blood hit the floor. I just want to say, before Sterling could finish the sentence, the emergency klaxons in the hospital corridors blared to life. It wasn't the standard red light for an incoming ambulance. It was a strobing, blinding white light. The PA system crackled, cutting through the ambient noise of the storm. Attention all personnel. Code Triage Mescal. Code Triage Mescal. All available medical staff report to the emergency department immediately. This is not a drill. Sarah's eyes locked onto Sterling's. The conversation was over. The ghost was gone. The soldier had returned. They need me, she said. She turned on her heel and sprinted toward the stairwell, leaving Sterling standing in the hallway. The storm had not just knocked out power, it had caused a catastrophic structural failure. A mile down the road, a community recreation center, being used as an overflow storm shelter, had succumbed to the hurricane-force winds. The massive, flat roof had inverted and collapsed, burying over 60 civilians under tons of steel decking, concrete, and shattered glass. When Sarah burst through the stairwell doors and back into the ER, it looked like a war zone. The automatic doors were wedged open, and EMS crews were flooding the hallway, wheeling in stretchers, carrying people in their arms, and dragging the walking wounded. The pristine white floors were already tracked with mud, rainwater, and blood. The agonizing sounds of moaning children, screaming adults, and shouting paramedics echoed off the tiled walls. Dr. Thomas Arris was standing in the center of the main triage desk, a clipboard in his hand, looking completely paralyzed. The influx was too fast, too brutal. Standard civilian triage requires careful assessment, charting, and patient routing. There was no time for any of it. Arris, Sarah shouted, cutting through the noise as she reached the desk. Status. We have 22 red tags already, Dr. Arris stammered, his eyes wide and unfocused. Blunt force traumas, crush injuries, tension pneumos from crushed ribs. I don't have enough ventilators. I don't have enough beds. Jenkins, I don't know who to take to surgery first." Sarah saw the terror in his eyes. He was a brilliant surgeon in a sterile room, but he was drowning in the chaos of mass casualty combat triage. "You don't take anyone yet," Sarah ordered, her voice cutting like a whip. "You stay here. You are the conductor. Brenda, break out the triage tags. We are switching to start protocol immediately. I want black tags on the dead, red tags on the critical, yellow on the delayed. Do not waste time on CPR for cardiac arrests. We don't have the hands." "We can't just let them die," Brenda cried out, holding a bloody bandage to a screaming teenager's head. "If you spend 20 minutes on a chest compression for someone who is already gone, 3 people with survivable bleedouts will die in the hallway," Sarah said, grabbing a fistful of red and black triage ribbons from the crash cart. "Do it. That is a direct order." Suddenly, the heavy double doors of the ER swung open, and Commander Sterling strode in, followed by Miller and Jackson. They had retrieved their secondary med kits from the Black Hawk. They looked out of place among the scrubs and lab coats, massive figures in tactical pants and boots, but their eyes were terrifyingly calm. "Mitchell is stable. The docs are closing his leg," Sterling announced, walking straight up to Sarah. He didn't look at Dr. Aris. He looked at her. "Tell us what you need, Captain." Dr. Aris blinked, bewildered. "Captain?" Sarah didn't flinch. She accepted the title, the shift in command, without a second of hesitation. "I need corpsmen, Commander. I have massive hemorrhage and airway compromises, and a civilian staff that is hesitating. You have 3 Tier 1 operators, trained in advanced trauma life support," Sterling said, dropping a heavy canvas bag of military-grade tourniquets onto the desk. "Deploy us." "Miller," Sarah barked, pointing to the hallway, where a row of stretchers lined the wall. "I have 3 crush injuries with traumatic amputations. Tourniquet high and tight. Pack the junctions, and mark the time on their foreheads with a Sharpie. Go." "On it, ma'am," Miller grunted, sprinting down the hall. "Jackson," she continued, "Bay 2. A chest crush. He's cyanotic. He needs bilateral needle decompressions and bag valve mask ventilation. Do not wait for an X-ray. Decompress and bag him." "Copy that," Jackson said, disappearing into the trauma bay. "Commander," Sarah said, looking at Sterling, "with me, we are running the floor." For the next 2 hours, Centaura General Hospital ceased to function as a civilian medical center. It operated as a forward operating base under heavy fire. Sarah moved through the sea of broken bodies with terrifying efficiency. She didn't offer soft words of comfort. She offered action. She relocated a dislocated shoulder of a screaming woman with a single, brutal yank. She directed Sterling to hold pressure on a severed carotid artery of an elderly man, while she clamped the vessel with a pair of hemostats under the dim light of a backup generator. At one point, a panicked resident froze while trying to intubate a child whose airway was swelling shut from a crush-induced anaphylactic response. The resident's hands were shaking so badly, the laryngoscope was rattling against the child's teeth. "I can't see the cords. There's too much blood." The resident panicked, tears streaming down his face. Sarah stepped in. She didn't raise her voice. She gently but firmly pushed the resident out of the way. "Step back. Breathe." She grabbed a scalpel from the tray. She didn't bother with the laryngoscope. She felt the child's neck, found the cricothyroid membrane with her thumb, and made a precise, vertical incision. Blood welled up, but she ignored it, inserting a small, specialized tube directly into the child's trachea. She attached the oxygen bag and squeezed. The child's chest rose perfectly. "Cricothyroidotomy successful," Sarah announced calmly, taping the tube in place. "Tape him, bag him, and move him to the yellow zone." Sterling watched her from across the room. He was holding pressure on a patient's abdomen, covered in a stranger's blood, but his eyes were locked on Sarah. He saw the way she moved, the way she calculated the horrific math of who lives and who dies, and the way the entire civilian hospital staff unconsciously began to orbit around her command. She wasn't just surviving the chaos. She was commanding it. Dr. Aris, having finally caught his breath, approached Sarah. The sheer volume of patients had finally begun to slow, as the EMS crews cleared the rubble at the rec center. "Jenkins," Eris breathed, wiping sweat from his forehead. He looked around the ER. It was a disaster zone of bloody gauze, discarded wrappers, and moaning patients. But every single salvageable life was stabilized. I have never seen anything like that. "You saved this hospital tonight." "We stabilized them, Doctor," Sarah corrected him, her voice tired, the adrenaline finally beginning to ebb. "Now you have to go to the OR and fix them. Get your surgical teams ready." As Eris hurried away to prep the surgical suites, Sarah leaned against the nurse's station counter. Her arms were trembling slightly. The phantom ache in her scarred forearm flared, a sharp, burning reminder of the last time she had stood in a room this full of blood. Sterling walked over, wiping his hands with a chemical towel. He didn't say a word. He simply reached into his pocket, pulled out a clean, sealed bottle of water from his med kit, and set it on the counter next to her hand. Sarah looked at the bottle, then up at the towering seal. "Good work, Captain," Sterling said softly. Sarah took a slow, deep breath, her eyes scanning the room of sleeping, stabilized patients. For the first time in 5 years, she didn't feel the need to hide behind the quiet mask of Nurse Jenkins. "Thanks, Commander," she replied, her voice steady. "Let's go check on your man." Dawn broke over the Virginia coastline like a bruised eye. The howling winds of the nor'easter had finally died down, leaving behind a sky the color of cold iron and a landscape littered with downed power lines, shattered oak trees, and flooded intersections. Inside Centerra, Virginia Beach General, the chaotic frenzy of the night had settled into the exhausted, mechanical hum of recovery. The mass casualty protocol was officially deactivated. Sarah Jenkins stood at the sink in the staff locker room, staring at her reflection in the harsh fluorescent light. Her scrubs were stained with a tapestry of dried blood. Some belonged to the civilians from the rec center collapse. But the dark, rust-colored streaks on her sleeves belonged to the SEAL operator, Mitchell. She turned on the tap, letting the scalding water run over her hands, mechanically scrubbing under her fingernails with a bristled brush. She was tired. It was a bone-deep, soul-crushing fatigue that she hadn't felt since the mountains of Afghanistan. For 5 years, she had meticulously built the persona of the quiet, detached civilian nurse. She had buried Captain Jenkins in a classified file and locked away the memories of mortar fire and the smell of burning diesel. But in a single night, the walls had crumbled. Commander Sterling had seen right through her. The beast of her past had been awakened, and she didn't know how to put it back to sleep. A soft knock on the locker room door broke her reverie. "Sarah?" It was Brenda. The older nurse's voice, usually laced with a sharp, gossipy edge, was uncharacteristically tentative. Sarah grabbed a paper towel and dried her hands. "Come in, Brenda." Brenda pushed the door open slowly. She looked at Sarah as if seeing a completely different person. There was no annoyance in her eyes anymore. There was only a raw, undisguised awe. "Doctor, Eris is looking for you. He wants you to consult on the post-op care for the crush victims." "I'm an ER nurse, Brenda. Post-op is the ICU's domain," Sarah replied softly, turning back to her locker. "Not today," Brenda said, stepping into the room. Eris said, "He doesn't want anyone else making the call on their fluid resuscitation," he said. He said, "You saved the hospital last night." Brenda swallowed hard, her eyes dropping to the faded starburst scar on Sarah's forearm. "I owe you an apology. I called you a robot. I said you were disconnected. I didn't know. I mean, none of us knew." "You didn't know because I didn't want you to know," Sarah said, offering a faint, tired smile. "There's nothing to apologize for, Brenda. We all have our ways of coping. Mine was just blending in." "Well, you're doing a terrible job of blending in right now," Brenda said, a nervous chuckle escaping her lips, "because the lobby is full of people in very serious uniforms, and they are asking for you." Sarah's blood ran cold. She closed her locker with a sharp metallic clang. "Who?" "Military," Brenda whispered. "A lot of them." Sarah bypassed the staff lounge and marched directly toward the intensive care unit on the 3rd floor. The hallways, usually bustling with morning shift changes, were eerily quiet. As she rounded the corner toward the surgical ICU, she saw them. Two men in crisp, dark blue naval uniforms stood guard outside room 312 Mitchell's room. But they weren't what made Sarah stop in her tracks. Standing at the nurse's station, casually reviewing a physical chart with an intimidated charge nurse, was a man wearing the service dress uniform of a United States Army Lieutenant General. 3 silver stars gleamed on his shoulders. It was Lieutenant General Richard Dick Cavanaugh, the commanding officer of the Joint Special Operations Command, JSOC. General Cavanaugh was a legend in the special operations community. He was a man who had orchestrated the most dangerous, highly classified missions of the last decade. And he was a man Sarah had actively hidden from for 5 years. Beside him stood Commander Sterling, freshly showered and wearing standard Navy working uniforms, looking like a giant next to the aging general. "General Cavanaugh," Sarah said, her voice echoing slightly in the quiet corridor. The general turned. His face was weathered, deeply lined from years of desert sun and the heavy burden of command. When his eyes locked onto Sarah, the stern, terrifying visage of the JSOC commander melted away. "Hello, Captain," Cavanaugh said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. He handed the chart back to the stunned charge nurse and walked toward her. "I am a civilian now, General." "The rank doesn't apply," Sarah said, standing her ground, though her heart was hammering against her ribs. "A piece of paper from the Department of Veterans Affairs might say you're a civilian," Cavanaugh countered, stopping 2 feet away from her. "But the 50-odd people downstairs who are breathing this morning because of your tactical triage would disagree. And Commander Sterling here gave me a very detailed, highly insubordinate report about a civilian nurse who performed a combat-grade cricothyroidotomy and bypassed a live explosive charge in a civilian trauma bay." Sarah shot a glaring look at Sterling. "You ran my file. I told you to drop it." "I ran your file on a secure JSOC server," Sterling replied, completely unapologetic. "When you trigger a level 5 clearance alert, it rings directly on the general's desk. I just confirmed the location." Dr. Eris, who had been standing down the hall frozen in shock, slowly approached. "General, I'm sorry. I am Dr. Thomas Eris, the attending surgeon. I don't understand. Nurse Jenkins is Captain Sarah Jenkins." General Cavanaugh interrupted, not taking his eyes off Sarah. "She is a Silver Star recipient. 5 years ago, during a classified operation in the Arghandab River Valley, her forward surgical tent was obliterated by enemy artillery. She was the sole surviving medical officer. With a shattered right arm, she dragged 3 wounded men out of a fatal funnel, established a triage bunker under heavy machine gun fire, and kept an entire team of Tier 1 operators alive for 48 hours until exfiltration." Dr. Eris's jaw dropped. He looked at the quiet, unassuming woman who had calmly handed him hemostats in the dark. He thought of how he had patronized her, how he had assumed she was just a paper pusher from the Midwest. "You disappeared, Sarah," Cavanaugh said softly, the military formality dropping from his voice. "You refused the medal ceremony. You refused the medical retirement pension. You just vanished." "I didn't want the medal, General," Sarah said, her voice cracking for the first time. The sterile walls of the hospital seemed to close in around her. "A medal is just a piece of metal they give you to make up for the blood you can't wash off. I couldn't save Staff Sergeant Miller. I couldn't save Chief Davis. I didn't want a parade for surviving when they didn't." "You saved 14 men," Cavanaugh said, taking a step closer. His eyes were suddenly bright with unshed emotion. 14 men came home to their wives and their children because you refused to let them die in that dirt. "Do you know why I flew through a hurricane to get to this hospital the second your security file pinged?" Sarah shook her head slowly. "Because one of the men you dragged out of the kill zone, the ranger, with the severed femoral artery that you clamped with your bare hands while taking a sniper round to the arm." Cavanaugh's voice broke. He took a deep, shuddering breath. "That was my son, Captain Michael Cavanaugh." The silence in the ICU hallway was absolute. Sarah's breath hitched. The memory, suppressed for half a decade, violently forced its way to the surface. She remembered the young ranger. She remembered the blinding pain in her arm, the slick coppery mud, and the desperate, pleading look in the young man's eyes as she tied a tourniquet with her teeth. "Michael is alive," the general whispered, reaching out and gently placing his hand on Sarah's shoulder. "He has a little girl now. Her name is Sarah. He named her after the ghost who saved his life." A single tear broke free and rolled down Sarah's cheek. The heavy, suffocating armor she had worn for 5 years cracked straight down the middle. She wasn't just a survivor of a massacre. She was a healer. She had brought life out of the darkest, most violent place on earth. "He's okay?" Sarah choked out, the Midwest accent fading, replaced by the raw emotion of a soldier asking about her brother in arms. "He's perfect," Kavanaugh smiled. "He wanted to be here, but he's currently deployed. He made me promise to find you." Sterling stepped forward. "Mitchell is awake, Captain. He's groggy, but they saved the leg. He wants to see the woman who ripped his rig off." Sarah wiped her face, taking a deep, shuddering breath. The ghost was finally laid to rest. "Let's go see him, Commander." By 0800 hours, Sarah's shift was officially over. The hospital administrator had arrived. A flurry of panic and paperwork, trying to manage the media circus brewing outside due to the storm damage and the sudden, heavy military presence. Sarah had packed her small duffel bag in the locker room. She took one last look at the pristine, pressed scrubs hanging on the hook, the uniform of her hiding place. She didn't need to hide anymore. Centera General knew who she was. The world knew who she was. And for the first time in a long time, she was entirely at peace with it. She slung the duffel over her shoulder and walked out of the locker room. As she pushed through the double doors leading to the main emergency department lobby, she stopped dead in her tracks. The massive, cavernous hallway, usually a chaotic thoroughfare of stretchers and rushing personnel, was completely empty of civilian traffic. The hospital security had quietly rerouted everyone. Standing in 2 perfect, parallel lines flanking the exit were the men of Naval Special Warfare. Commander Sterling stood at the front. Behind him were Petty Officer Miller, Chief Jackson, and a dozen other heavily muscled operators who had arrived with General Kavanaugh. They were no longer covered in mud and blood. They were in their crisp, immaculate Navy working uniforms. At the end of the line, sitting in a hospital wheelchair with his leg heavily casted and elevated, was Mitchell. He was pale, but his eyes were sharp and entirely focused on her. But it wasn't just the SEALs. Behind the military operators stood the staff of Centera General. Dr. Thomas Harris was there, his white coat stained, his posture straight. Brenda stood next to him, wiping tears from her face. Paramedics, orderlies, and resident physicians lined the walls, standing in quiet, reverent awe. They had all heard the story. The whisper of Firebase Lima had spread through the hospital like wildfire. Sarah stood at the top of the hallway, her duffel bag suddenly feeling very light. The fluorescent lights overhead seemed to hum with an electric anticipation. General Kavanaugh stepped out from the center of the formation. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. Commander Sterling locked eyes with Sarah. He squared his massive shoulders and drew a deep breath that seemed to expand his chest by a foot. "Platoon." Sterling's voice thundered, a sharp, commanding bark that echoed off the tile walls and shattered the quiet of the morning. "Attention!" The sound of 24 combat boots, snapping together in perfect, synchronized unison, cracked like a gunshot. The operators stiffened, their spines rigid, their chins up. The civilian staff, instinctively reacting to the overwhelming aura of command, straightened up as well. "Present," Sterling roared. "Arms!" In absolute silence, the most lethal, elite warriors on the planet raised their right hands in a flawless, razor-sharp salute. There was no clapping. There were no cheers. There was only the profound, suffocating weight of absolute respect. It was the ultimate honor, bestowed not by a politician or a piece of paper, but by the men who knew the true, horrifying cost of war. They were saluting a warrior who had walked through the fire with them, a healer who had refused to let the darkness win. Mitchell, grimacing through the pain, grabbed the wheels of his chair, and pushed himself up onto his good leg. Leaning heavily against the wall, the wounded operator snapped his hand to his brow, saluting the woman who had pulled him back from the abyss. Sarah felt the tears hot and heavy in her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. She felt her posture shift. The stooped, tired hunch of the graveyard shift nurse vanished. Her shoulders rolled back. Her spine aligned. The ghost of Captain Jenkins stepped into the light. She stood tall, her eyes sweeping over the men and women in the hallway. She looked at Dr. Aris, who nodded deeply. She looked at Mitchell, who offered a faint, grateful smile. And finally, she looked at Commander Sterling. Slowly, with the crisp, deliberate precision of a seasoned combat officer, Sarah Jenkins raised her hand and returned the salute. The silence stretched for 10 long heartbeats, a moment frozen in time. A bridge built between the sterile halls of a civilian hospital and the bloody sands of a forgotten battlefield. "Order! Arms!" Sterling commanded. The hands snapped down. The tension in the hallway broke, replaced by a warm, overwhelming sense of camaraderie. General Kavanaugh walked up to her, holding a small, velvet box. He pressed it into her hand. "You don't have to wear it, Captain, but you earned it. It belongs to you." Sarah looked down at the box containing the silver star. She closed her hand around it, feeling the weight of the metal. She looked back up at the general and smiled. "Thank you, sir," Sarah said softly. "But my shift is over. I need to go home." She walked down the aisle of warriors, the sea of uniforms parting for her. As she pushed through the sliding glass doors and out into the crisp, rain-washed Virginia morning, she breathed in the fresh air. The storm was over. The sun was shining. And for the first time in 5 years, she wasn't hiding in the shadows. She was exactly where she was meant to be. Sarah's story is a powerful reminder that heroes don't always wear camouflage, and the deepest scars are often the ones we can't see. She hid her extraordinary bravery behind the quiet routine of a civilian nurse, but when the moment demanded it, her warrior spirit saved lives against impossible odds. It proves that true courage isn't about seeking the spotlight. It's about doing what is necessary when the world falls apart. We walk past people every day who carry unimaginable stories of sacrifice and survival. If this incredible true-to-life story of Captain Sarah Jenkins and the SEAL Team's silent salute moved you, please hit the like button and share this video to honor the quiet heroes among us. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications for more heart-pounding, real-life stories of courage and resilience.